In the second game of their series against the Houston Rockets, Steph Curry suffered a pretty gruesome looking injury to his left finger. It looked like he injured the finger going in to make a play on the ball, but we couldn't quite tell until we saw these photos going around on social media clearly indicating something wrong with that finger. Now we of course learned during the game that he had dislocated that middle finger, had the finger taped, x-rays were reportedly negative, and then he came back out on the court to keep playing. Welcome back everybody. For those new, my name's Brian. I'm a doctor and a sports fan, and it's my goal on this page to combine those interests to look at different sports injuries and sports medicine topics to try to teach you all more about what's going on. Now you may think, big deal, he dislocated his finger. This doesn't really seem like a complex enough thing to make a video about, but finger dislocations are one of the most common injuries that people suffer, in particular in the hand, and there's actually a lot of really complex and interesting anatomy in the fingers that can become injured whenever something like this happens. Being that most of you out there watching this have probably dislocated or jammed a finger if you've played basketball, I thought this would be interesting to explain some of the anatomy around the finger joints and what exactly happens with an injury like this. As always, subscribe if you guys like this type of content and want to see more, and let's jump into it. Now, the play where this supposedly happened, we can't really tell exactly what happened to that finger, but we can assume that something probably got jammed against the ball as he was going in here to make a play. We of course then saw him walking off the court, kind of shaking that hand in some obvious pain, and then when we saw these photos going around with this clear and obvious deformity in the finger, we knew something was up. Let's dive into our anatomy of the hand and the fingers in particular to explain what structures get injured with a dislocation like this. Some key anatomy terms to understand right off the bat. Flexion is whenever we bend our fingers down to make a fist or bend our wrist down. And then extension is whenever we straighten or bend up those finger joints. Dorsal surface of the hand is the backside or the top of the hand, and the palmar or the volar surface of the hand is the front or the palm. We have various carpal bones in the wrist, and then we have our metacarpal bones that are deep inside the palm. The second through fifth fingers are made up of three bones called the three phalanxes or the phalanges, and we name them based on their location closer to the body or far away from the body. So the first one closest to the rest of the hand is the proximal phalanx, the middle one is the middle phalanx, and then the farther out one is the distal phalanx. So whenever you bend your finger, there's 1, 2, 3 bones that are moving in that finger and 2 joints. The joints are called the interphalangeal joints. The one that's closer to the hand is the PIP or the proximal interphalangeal joint, and then the one further away is the DIP or the distal joint. Now Curry's injury occurred on the third or the middle finger at that proximal PIP joint or the joint closest to the rest of the hand. So great, we've talked about the bones, but what about the ligaments and the muscles and tendons that are running through the fingers to help them function? Our finger joints are just like any other joint in the body that needs structure and stability from ligaments surrounding them. On each side of these finger joints, we actually have little tiny collateral ligaments similar to the MCL and the LCL in the knee that prevent that side-to-side movement in the finger. Oftentimes when you just simply jam your finger, you've had a sprain of one of these collateral ligaments. So those are on the side. Now on the palmar or on the volar surface of the finger is something called the volar plate. This is another ligamentous structure that helps prevent hyperextension of the finger. So we bend our fingers, but then ultimately we get to a point where we can't bend our finger any further backwards. And it's those volar plates that are on the front side of the joints that prevent that hyperextension. On the backside or the dorsum of the finger, we have the big long tendons from the muscles that extend or straighten our fingers that run up and insert at that far fingertip. There's a structure on that backside of the finger called the central slip, which is another ligamentous type structure that provides some stability and support for that extensor tendon and the finger joint. Let's talk next about finger dislocation. So we can classify them into 2 broad categories, and we classify it based on the direction that the dislocated piece moved. So if this is my finger, if the dislocated piece moves upward or towards the dorsal surface of the hand, we call it a dorsal dislocation. If it moves downward, we call it a volar dislocation. Most common is whenever that piece moves upward, so a dorsal dislocation. And this looks like what happened with Curry. If we look back at the picture here, this joint where that deformity is the proximal interphalangeal joint or the PIP. And this is the one that's most commonly affected with these dislocations. That remaining segment at the fingertip looks like it's kind of displaced outward, which would be the most common type of dislocation in these fingers. Now for this type of dislocation to happen, you have to have tearing or injury to those ligaments in the finger joint. There's usually tearing of the collateral ligaments that run on the outside, and then in this case, also tearing or shearing of that volar plate. Looking at the picture here, if you imagine that there's this ligamentous structure going over kind of that underside of the finger, Based on how severe that deformity and that step off is, you can picture that there'd be some shearing of that structural support on the underside. What do we do about it? Well, as they did with Curry, you try to relocate it. You try to distract that joint and put it back in place. It's pretty common to have a fracture of one of those finger bones with this type of an injury because of where that volar plate tears. So that's why they do the x-rays to make sure that nothing is fractured or broken. Once you get it relocated and back in place, you do something called buddy taping. Buddy taping takes advantage of the structural support that's still intact in the nearby fingers to sort of give yourself a splint for that injured joint. You're using your good finger as a buddy for the finger that's been injured. Specifically, even with Curry's taping, it looks like they had a piece of tape above and below that PIP joint that dislocated to provide some additional support. What can we expect then with recovery and how this might affect him going forward? If it's just a simple dislocation with no fracture, then you're looking at usually around a few weeks or so of taping that finger to allow those ligaments time to heal. It wouldn't be surprising if we hear that Curry has an MRI of the hand just to make sure there's no more severe damage in that finger, but typically with proper taping, these things heal up just fine. But I think there's a good chance this could actually affect his game going forward. Just the sheer amount of pain that you have after something like this is going to be distracting. The second thing is that because of the usual injury to that volar plate that's on the palmar side of the hand, anytime he tries to catch a pass with that hand, anytime he pushes off with that hand, you're putting pressure on that spot that's been damaged and you're gonna have more pain. Also, just having those fingers taped together impairs your normal function, and so it's gonna feel weird to do your normal basketball activities. Assuming they don't find any worse injury if they do any more investigation, it's not gonna make anything worse, it's just gonna be a question of the pain and how he'll have to get used to having that finger taped. So next time if you're out playing basketball or some other sport and you dislocate your finger, now maybe you can have a better sense of just what all those different structures are that could be damaged in your finger. Overall though, still a very benign type of injury to have. This is something that you can typically tape back up, and then once you get used to playing with the tape, things heal up pretty well. Thankfully, it's on his non-shooting hand. Otherwise, this would definitely be a concern for his shooting going forward. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching this one as always. Let me know any updates, comments, questions you have below. We, of course, in this same game had James Harden supposedly bleeding from his eye. And so if we get any more updates in the future about what happened there, I'll try to update you guys with a future video. Thanks as always for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.